Music touches us emotionally, where words alone can't. Rock and roll music has been a huge part of American culture for many decades now and has evolved throughout the years. The influence of rock and roll music from the 1960s set the example for artists to follow and expand on in the 1970s and 80s. Throughout this speech, I will discuss how rock and roll music has changed over time and the influential artists who contributed to this evolution. Let's start off with the 1960s. In the early 1960s, rock and roll was in its purest form. This decade had a very country and folk influenced style. 1960s rock music spawned a generation of singer-songwriters who wrote and performed their own work. One example would be the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys are an American rock band that was formed in Hawthorne, California in 1961. Their unique vocal harmonies and early surf songs made them one of the most influential bands of the rock era. Another major band of the 1960s was The Who. The Who were an English rock band that was formed in 1964. Their major contribution to rock music was the development of the rock opera. The Who sold over 100 million records worldwide and are considered one of the most influential rock bands of the 20th century. Another major rock band of the 1960s was the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones are an English rock band formed in London in 1962. The Rolling Stones were part of the British invasion of bands that became popular in the United States. Their style reflected the rebellious counterculture of the 1960s. The band is still around today, but the 1960s is generally considered to be the band's golden era. The last rock band of the 1960s I would like to discuss is the Beatles. The Beatles were an English rock band formed in Liverpool in 1960. Throughout their career, the Beatles experimented with several musical styles, ranging from pop ballads and Indian music to psychedelia and hard rock. They often would incorporate classical elements and unconventional recording techniques in innovative ways. The Beatles are widely regarded as the most influential music band in history. Rock and roll of the 1960s was completely different from any the world had ever seen before, and nobody could have imagined the changes that were to come in the next decade, the 1970s. The 1970s was a time of great change for rock music, where many subgenres began to gain popularity. Hard rock was one of the most prominent subgenres of rock music in the 1970s. Bands such as Queen and Led Zeppelin exhibited this style of rock. Queen were a British rock band that formed in London in 1970. They gained international popularity after releasing A Night at the Opera in 1975. Estimates of their record sales range from 170 million to 300 million, making them one of the world's best-selling music artists. Just like Queen, Led Zeppelin was an English rock band formed in London. Led Zeppelin formed in 1968 and had huge commercial success with 8 studio albums released over 11 years. Their untitled 4th studio album featuring the song Stairway to Heaven, which is among the most popular and influential works in rock music history. Another notable band of the 1970s was Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd were an English rock band formed in London in 1965. Pink Floyd was known for its philosophical lyrics and elaborate live shows. Their albums The Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall became 2 of the best-selling albums of all time, and they are considered to be one of the most influential groups in popular music history. The 1970s set a whole new standard for rock and roll, and the decade to come had very high expectations to live up to. In the 1980s, the arena rock trend from the 1970s continued and gained more popularity with bands like Journey. Journey was an American rock band that formed in San Francisco in 1973. The band has gone through several phases, but its strongest commercial success was in the 1980s. Throughout that decade, the band released a series of hit songs, including Don't Stop Believin', which in 2009 became the top-selling track in iTunes history. The 1980s also saw the resurgence of hard rock music and the beginning of its metal subgenre. Bands such as AC/DC and Guns N' Roses reflected the hard rock music style. AC/DC were an Australian rock band formed in Sydney in 1973. On July 5th, 1980, the band released their album Back in Black, which gained them popularity worldwide and became their all-time bestseller. Guns N' Roses was an American hard rock band from Los Angeles, California, formed in 1985. Their debut album, Appetite for Destruction, reached number 1 on the Billboard 200 only a year after its release. This album is America's best-selling debut album of all time. The rock music of the 1980s reflected the generations of rock that had come before it and set the stage for the rock music we have today. Throughout this speech, I have discussed the evolution of rock and roll from the 1960s through the 1980s, and the artists who were influential in this evolution. I hope that I have shown how the influence of rock and roll music from the 1960s set the example for artists to follow and expand on in the 70s and 80s and beyond. Music touches us emotionally, where words alone can't. The music created throughout these decades helps to paint a picture of all the moments and emotions that people who lived during these times experienced.